Lecture 6 Translation Gain. The generic differences in the two language systems naturally generate loss on all levels. Gain, on the other hand, is very rare, if ever, because, as Bassinet points out, translation theoreticians as well as practitioners are mainly concerned with matters of equivalence and the like, ignoring what can also be gained, for the translator can at times enrich or clarify the source language text. Moreover, what is often seen as lost from the source language context may be replaced in the target language context. By the same token, Nida and Taber aver that whereas one inevitably loses many idioms in the process of translation, one can also stand to gain a number of idioms. Nida calls for some sort of compensation for the loss of source language idiom. One of the difficulties is that too often translators are not sufficiently sensitive to the possibilities of idiomatic expressions, and hence the end result is a weakening of the figurative force of the translation, since they do not compensate for the loss of certain idiom by the introduction of others. Gain can be achieved mostly on the stylistic rhetorical level through the following strategies, among others. 1. Adopting a target language-oriented strategy so as to reproduce a natural and original piece of literary art. Implementing the principle, the best translation is the one that does not sound as translation. 2. Repudiating the formal equivalence which produces literal, wooden, and unnatural translation towards a functional dynamic one. 3. Introducing an idiom or a rhetorical device in the target text for a non-existent one in the source text. Here are some examples. In translating the poem by Jamil bin Muammar or Jamil Buthaina, Nicholson likens Jamil's pure platonic love for Buthaina to rain, echoing Shakespeare's similitude of mercy to rain when Portia addresses Shylock to show mercy to Antonio. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as gentle rain from heaven. Look at the Arabic translation of this stanza. سمة الرحمة لا تحدها حدود تنزل من السماء كالمطر الودود. Nicholson has not only introduced the metaphor rain, the heavenly blessing and vital for the Arabs, but also some metaphors which do not exist in the original text. Let's read the following poem. ألا ليت ريعان الشباب جديد ودهر تولى يا بثين يعود فنغني كما كنا نكون وأنتم فنغنى كما كنا نكون وأنتم قريب وإذ ما تبذلين زهيد ألا ليت شعري هل أبيتن ليلة بوادي القرى إني إذن لسعيد إلى نهاية القصيدة. Let's look for the English translation of the same poem, of Jamil's poem. Oh, mighty flower, anew that youthful prime, and restore to us, Buthaina, the begone time, and might we again the blessed as we want to be, when the folk were nigh and grudged what thou gavest me. To the end of the poem. Look, to counterbalance the inevitable loss in the translation of Dua al-Karawan, the call of the Dua al-Karawan, yes, with its poetic style and highly classical and Quranic language, we have painstakingly attempted to achieve some gains by creating, for instance, an idiom or a metaphor that has no counterpart in the original. وهل نذكر, for example, وهل نذكر تلك المأساة التي شهدناها معا وعجزنا أن ندفعها أو نصرف شرها عن تلك النفس الزكية التي أزهقت وعن الدم البريء الذي سفك. دعاء الكروان صفحة 10. So that together we may evoke the tragedy to which we were witnesses, which we could not prevent happening, and whose evil we could not keep away from that soul which was extinguished and that blood which was shed. والخطوب تنتقل بهن من قرية إلى أخرى ومن ضيعة إلى ضيعة يلقين بعض اللين هنا ويلقين بعض الشدة هناك. So, and this is the translation of the Arabic text. Where could I find? So this is the translation of the Arabic text. Where could I find the strength to put out my hand at mist? These hands or make my jaws labor like those other jaws. All I could do was to sit among those women, glancing at them, irritated by them, cheating my hunger with small fine pieces of bread. So we have here many examples of, reflecting the notion and realizing the notion of translation gain. Now, translation gain is something rare, as we have mentioned before, especially when you are targeting or translating or about to translate a literary text. Loss will happen more frequently than gain, and therefore you need to develop your tactics and adopt many strategies and utilize many strategies so as to be a very efficient translator. Because once you are about to translate a poem, for example, many of its aesthetic elements will be lost in the process of translation. Thank you for listening, dear students, and I look forward to seeing you in the near future, and I will upload the next lecture 7, which is about translation loss, next Tuesday, inshallah. So till then, be safe. Bye-bye. For as long as individuals have communicated with one another through the mediation of someone else, there has probably been a realization that mediators do something more complex and more interesting than simply substitute their own words one by one for the originals. Since the early 1950s, however, there has been an upsurge in serious studies of translation, both in its theoretical, historical, and professional dimensions, and in its practice at the point when translators do something in response to their own reading of a text, and which leads to the production of a second text. In particular, it is now understood that translators do not simply say in one language what somebody or some piece of writing has said in another. Whatever translation is in its entirety, it seems to involve semiotic, linguistic, textual, lexical, social, sociological, cultural, and psychological aspects or elements, all of which are being studied nowadays as determining factors in whatever the translator does. It is also becoming clear that, as in any other form of rewriting, this implies manipulation and relates directly to ideology, power, value systems, and perceptions of reality. One of the many questions that recur explicitly or implicitly in these investigations is whether there is something objective, there is some objective entity, linguistic, semantic, or psychological, expressed in or by an original, which can be then captured by a different text, the translation. In other words, is there something in behind, underneath, or belonging to a piece of writing in one language which can be extrapolated and safely packaged in another? After all, at first sight, something seems to survive and pass more or less intact from one text to another in the process and the product of translation. We may therefore ask whether or how this actually happens and what that something may be. Certain aspects of language, such as words and grammar, appear to disappear or change completely in translation, and yet the meaning, what might be termed the semantic import, usually survives the process quite well. Beyond these impressions, what is it then, if anything, that is actually transferred between one text and another? Is it some part, ingredient, or linguistic element of the text itself? Or is it something less direct about the text, such as a particular reader's reaction or interpretation of it? And what happens to those elements which are not transferred? Are they irrelevant, surplus to requirements, treated of no importance, and simply ignored? Is translation some kind of science, pure or applied, prescriptive or descriptive, or is it a practical art or craft which cannot be discussed until after the event? Analogously to a conversation about the beauty of a sunset or a bird in flight, if the notion that something remains unscathed in the process of translation is too extreme, then perhaps there may be aspects of the original and the translation which, if not identical, are at least equivalent to one another. For some time now, the notion of equivalence, or rather equivalencies, has been debated with varying degrees of enthusiasm and conviction. So, the notion of equivalence has been debated with varying degrees of enthusiasm and conviction. It may also be that translation is merely an approximate, imprecise procedure, and that any text has so many dimensions that equivalence on one may be incompatible with equivalence on some others. For example, linguistic equivalence, which is an extreme case of which would be word-for-word translation, may conflict with the dynamic equivalence. Here, dynamic equivalence means or refers to the stimulating or the process of stimulating an effect in the reader of the translation, similar to that caused in the reader of the original. In the sense that if the linguistic surface of both texts is similar, the effect on their readers may necessarily be very different, and vice versa. And does translation deal with what the original author intended, or simply what is expressed by the text? Among these approaches to research on translation, which are yielding useful insights nowadays, translation studies has been in particular favor since the mid-1960s. Translation studies concentrates on describing and analyzing the procedure or processes rather than commenting on the product itself and asking how well or badly any particular translation has been done. This non-prescriptive approach, among others, is interested in how translation is actually done, examining the methods that have been used throughout history and asking how texts fit into the receiving cultures. Much work is also being carried out on the teaching of translation, with or without some kind of theoretical or academic underpinning. Universities and similar institutions educate graduates who go on to earn their living as translators. Some courses use translation merely as a methodological tool for language teaching, without claiming to train translators, while others provide training in all aspects of the translator's work, including practice in various registers, gathering and storing terminology, compiling databases, documentation. So, closely related to teaching is assessment or evaluation, quality assurance, or revision of translation as part of the process itself, or carried out on the product. It is done on various levels, from the practitioner's own impressionistic assessment of a first draft or a teacher's equally subjective, but perhaps more experience-based comments on a student's piece of work to more academic attempts to develop systematic methods for the evaluation of professional work. The profession of the translator, with its problems and practical considerations, is sporadically, though seldom systematically, treated in journals and newsletters. The practice of the profession under pressure, working to deadlines, satisfying different types of client, using dictionaries of all kinds, whether monolingual or multilingual, general or technical, hard copy or computer-based, by in-house or freelance practitioners, making use of expert or other informants. So making use of expert or other informants, often the clients themselves, is occasionally discussed, usually on many different levels. Despite much research, or even calls for general theories and systems to explain or describe the translation process, most work on the subject continues to address specific problems and individual elements or aspects of translation, including comparisons on brief texts with their originals. These studies range from the treatment of such detailed points as puns or culture-specific terms to advice on how to handle legal documents between systems which have neither terminology nor legal entities in common. They may rely on intuitive reactions to the readability of a particular translation or on academic investigations of contrastive structural linguistics. The volume of work being done and the multiplicity of approaches used suggests that the study of translation is actively attempting to emerge from its infancy. Much of the same may be said on other levels of language. Let's take other branches of language. Let's take pragmatics as an example. Since 1938, when Charles Marst defined semiotics as the use of signs governed by syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic rules, but more particularly since 1959, when Rodolphe Carope explained that pragmatics refers to the relationships between signs and their users. The discipline has been developed with enthusiasm by philosophers and linguists alike. It entered an especially meaningful phase precisely in 1962, when J.L. Austin's contribution to the subject was published under the title How to Do Things with Words, which showed that when using language, people do not just talk or write to one another, but rather they perform actions. They do things, usually in contexts that combine linguistic and non-linguistic elements, part of the context in which they communicate consisting of the knowledge, beliefs, and assumptions of all concerned. Following Austin's work, pragmatics has focused on the conditions which permit speakers and writers to achieve what they want to achieve by bringing about certain modifications in the behavior, knowledge, attitudes, or beliefs of others. It studies what language users mean, as distinct from what their language means. The rules and principles governing their use of language over and above the rules of language itself, grammar or vocabulary, and what makes some uses of language more appropriate than others in certain situations. In general, pragmatic approaches attempt, as well as semantic approaches to translation, attempt to explain translation, procedure, process, and product from the point of view of what is potentially done. So, as has been said earlier, linguistic approaches as well, semantic approaches as well as pragmatic approaches to translation, all of which attempt to explain translation procedure, process, and product form, or from the point of view of what is potentially done by the original author or by the text, what is potentially done in the translation as a response to the original, how and why it is done in that way in that context. If we return to the question of whether there is something in an original text which is carried over in its translation, according to pragmaticists might suggest that something does indeed survive in the process, namely, at the very least, what is potentially done by or in the original text, since the translation has the same capability. We say that the very least because, of course, if an original text, for example, informs, entertains, demands, or a payment of a debt, or apologizes for some mistake, the translation will be expected to not only perform these actions, but also do so in a manner similar to the original. It will have to convey the same and not different information the entertainment will have to be of the same kind in both texts. So if we distinguish syntactic from sentential units, on the other hand, Sander Hervey defines sentence building as endowing a meaningful linguistic unit with an illocutionary function. He explains that although illocutionary functions can be understood across the most diverse cultural boundaries, their cultural relativity makes it difficult to transfer them in translation. He proposes a strategic approach which keeps very much in mind that to convey these functions, English, for example, predominantly uses intonation. German, on the other side, prefers illocutionary particles, while Hungarian resorts to sequential focus. The mechanisms available to signal the distinction between theme or information already known to readers and dream or new information vary from language to language. It is said that inflection rather than word order largely fulfills this function in Russian. A translator then has to decide how to convey the theme-rhyme structure of an original text using whatever means the target language can offer. A good fit requires replication of the original theme-rhyme structure, communicative value, message and thrust, while respecting the target language's grammar and style. Yet, just as willingness to risk deviance may mark a good writer, so also it may mark a good translator.